I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Spandrew Spice.
Welcome to Deep Cuts, the podcast where we pick a topic and walk you through the ins, the outs, and the nitty-gritty so you can appear like an interesting and idiosyncratic person at your next forced social function. Today's topic is...
Richard Montañez, Part 2.
Who is Richard Montañez? He's a retired executive from the Frito Lay Corporation who spent the better part of the 2000s and 2010s touring college and corporate campuses, giving public motivational speeches about how, in the late 80s, he was a lowly, impoverished janitor working at a Frito Lay factory in Rancho Cucamonga, California, who came up with the idea for the company's most popular product, Flamin Hot Cheetos. After inventing the smash success snack, his life became a rags to riches fairy tale, going from a poor working-class Mexican family man to a rich corporate executive overnight. His story has inspired many, brought him tons of media and viral attention over the years, and even resulted in a feature-length Hollywood film being developed about his life. The only problem? The entire thing was a huge lie.
Act 3. A noble lie for a more civilized age. Richard Montañez had been touring the country, proselytizing about his rise to prominence for years. But the production of the Hollywood film about his life brought a lot more attention to the story than there had ever been before, with it mostly traveling within communities of young Hispanic school kids and business-minded motivational types hooked on corporate hopium porn, promising that they could one day too become rich and powerful if they just yanked on their bootstraps hard enough. The kids took the story at face value because why wouldn't they? And the business bros needed it as just another inspirational quote in an Instagram post that they could share in order to manifest their future wealth. No discernment whatsoever. But now there was a lot more eyeballs on it. And with more eyeballs comes more scrutiny. People started to notice some inconsistencies in Richard's story very quickly. Notably, the announcement of the film, along with various articles about Richard's story, started making their rounds on social media in 2018. And they were noticed by Lynn Greenfield, a former product developer for Frito Lay. The only problem with Richard's story, according to her, was that she and a few of her colleagues fucking invented Flamin Hot Cheetos. Understandably confused about this new viral sensation claiming to have invented one of her own product development projects from decades ago, she reached out to PepsiCo and questioned them about it. Considering that Richard had apparently been spending the last several decades doing speaking engagements, writing books, and having a movie produced claiming he invented Flamin Hot Cheetos, all while he was still working for Frito Lay, and they hadn't said a word about it, it seemed like they were co-signing what, to Greenfield, was a flagrant lie that stole credit from her and others on the Flamin Hot Cheetos project. The company took her complaint and decided to launch a formal investigation into the validity of Richard's claim to the creation of the spicy snack. But the public would not know the results of this investigation until a few years later, when the LA Times dropped a major expose on Richard and the upcoming Flamin Hot Cheetos movie titled The Man Who Didn't Invent Flamin Hot Cheetos on May 16th of 2021. In the article, journalist Sam Dean conducted a thorough investigation that involved interviewing several past and present employees at PepsiCo in order to get to the bottom of who really invented the snack. And the conclusion was that it was decidedly not Richard Montañez. First, there was the internal investigation conducted by PepsiCo in 2018, after Lynn Greenfield's complaint. As quoted in the LA Times article, PepsiCo concluded,
"None of our records show that Richard was involved in any capacity in the Flamin Hot test market. We have interviewed multiple personnel who were involved in the test market, and all of them indicate that Richard was not involved in any capacity in the test market. That doesn't mean we don't celebrate Richard, but the facts do not support the urban legend. We value Richard's many contributions to our company, especially his insight into Hispanic consumers. But we do not credit the creation of Flamin Hot Cheetos or any Flamin Hot products to him."
So we're going to get into this, obviously. This second episode is basically just going through the fallout of people discovering that this was not true. But up top, it's first and foremost already completely fascinating, and I'm wondering what you think about this. I mean, first of all, before I even say what I'm going to say, I guess we kind of talked about like what your knowledge of this story was how much you knew about Richard Montañez and the invention of Flamin Hot Cheetos. So I guess this is almost, we know what you're going to say, but like, did you have any idea about this sort of second act of this story, the whole revelation that this was a lie? Like, what was any of your knowledge of this prior to this episode?
I think my knowledge of this is you being like, hey, I found this fucking urban legend and it's not true. And then I was like, sick, let's do an episode about it. Because a lot of our brainstorming starts that way. One of us just texts the other one, hey, I found this thing and it's fucking wrong or it's not real or whatever. And then you started writing it and you were like, actually, there's a little bit more gray area here. Maybe, how should we restructure this? And so we kind of talked about what the structure of the episode would be. But that's kind of all that I know is just from that one conversation. I will say, though, that I think it's really weird that they allowed that movie to happen if it's not real.
Yeah.
Like, how did that movie get through? Like, didn't they have to get Flamin Hot Cheetos / fucking, what's it called, approval? Like, didn't they have to get it, like, rubber stamped at least?
So, everything that you just said, what you just said about the movie, that's the thing that we're going to need to unpack. And it's super fascinating. And this is really what compelled me to do this episode in the first place. I know, as you just said, that it kind of changed from, like, the initial discovery of the story. It changed a little bit. But the ultimate inspiration for this was, I've never heard of anything like this ever happening before. Because the way these stories go is pretty cut and dry every single time. Big companies are extremely protective of their IP, their ownership of products, and their story, right? Like, more than anything, that is the thing that they are most protective of in the public eye, is those three things. So many other aspects of what a company is, you know, they don't really care that much about. I mean, famously, somebody made a movie where they shot it without permission inside of Disney World. And it was called Escape from Tomorrow. And it was like a weird rip-off David Lynch-esque art film where a family goes on a trip to Disney World and the dad goes insane while they're in Disney World. And the whole marketing behind the movie was like, this is the fucking movie that Disney doesn't want you to fucking see. They're going to shut us down in a second. We're fucked. Come see this shit. And then the movie ended up kind of not really doing very well because Disney just ignored it and they didn't care. Because you would think that Disney would be like super protective of that, of like, oh, you filmed inside of our park and you made a movie that takes place inside of Disney World. But as it turns out, as long as you're not like claiming ownership of something about Disney, like was done with the Air Pirates, another episode that was done on Deep Cuts, where they literally took characters from Disney and put them into comics, and that got Disney's attention. Unless you're like claiming ownership of products that they've created, or you're fucking with their story in some way and saying like, Walt Disney was an anti-Semite, like they go out of their way to quash stories like that. Like they go out of their way to manipulate the narrative about that kind of stuff. But if you're just like gonna shoot a movie, like they don't really care that much because that doesn't fuck with the fundamentals of what Disney is as a company. And so normally in these situations, like a guy just said that he created one of the most popular products of the company, you would assume that they would just like nip that in the bud immediately. And the second part of this layer on top of that is that he worked at the company while he was actively doing this as a top executive. So you would think they would be like, hey, Richard, you got to stop this. But for 30 years, they did nothing. He went around and he was doing these speaking tours and he wrote books. He wrote 2 books in which he blatantly claims to have invented Flamin Hot Cheetos while he was working at the company, and nobody did anything. So the big question is, why?
Is it supposed to be like a doomsday scenario for them? Like, it's kind of like what happened with, what was the show with Jonathan Majors that was Lovecraft Country? There was like a Hollywood Reporter piece that came out last year, maybe the year before, where the reason Lovecraft Country got canceled is that the showrunner, who was a black woman, was abusing people on set and making an unsafe work environment, and therefore they just felt like it was a no-win scenario. Like they couldn't have a show that was about race in the way that that show was about race and then fire the showrunner because it would look bad and it would make them look like racists, but she was objectively in the wrong and being abusive. Therefore, their only option was to just kill the show, even though it was a success.
Yeah, it's like there's a no-win scenario here. Shut it down. Shut it all down.
Do you think maybe from a corporate perspective, they were like, this is our most popular product aimed at the Hispanic market. We didn't really pay attention to how much this guy was taking credit for this story up until this point. And now that it's, kind of folklore, dogma, whatever, we can't publicly disavow him because it will look like we're shitting on somebody that is very popular in the main quadrant of demographic that eats this product or enjoys this product.
I have many thoughts on this that we will talk about later. I think what you just said is like in the ballpark, right? Of course, this is my opinion. Like that could literally be exactly right. But in my opinion, you are almost there. And I think it's like, that's a big part of it. But there's something else to it that's a little different. There's like another aspect to it that I think is like, it changes a little bit, but it's like very close. But just up front, like that's the most compelling and interesting part of this is like why they allowed this to happen, how this movie got made, considering this. And what you've just said, I think is like a great partial ripping off of the Band-Aid. And we're going to get into like what the rest of it is, in my opinion. That being said, though, one of the really interesting parts of this is similar to you. I had a cursory idea of the story. As we discussed in the last episode, I actually thought that Flamin' Hot Cheetos must have been invented in the early 2000s because I had never heard of them until the early 2000s. And also they got super popular in a way that I had just never seen before in the early 2000s. When we were in high school, Flamin' Hot Cheetos became like the number one snack for kids. So my assumption was that they came out then, they were released and they just exploded in popularity. And I was surprised to learn that they came out in the late 80s. And I partially attribute that to the fact that I moved from New Mexico to California in the early 2000s. And just that like in New Mexico, we just literally didn't have anything.
To you, at that age, was Flamin' Hot Cheetos like this almost kind of like metaphorical beacon of culture? You like show up and you're like, with like a little bindle on a train, like 1920s hobo style, and you get off the train, and in the train station, there's a little, Frito Lay pop-up stand, and it's like Doritos, Cool Ranch. And you're like, I know those. And then there's a little one that's like Flamin' Hot Cheetos, and you're like, this is life in the big city, flamin' hot.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, do you know what the real thing of that is, though? In Roswell, New Mexico, like New Mexico is one thing, and I don't know exactly what the cultural like delay is between California and New Mexico, because, California and New York do kind of like jump on cultural trends a little bit faster than some of the inner states. I don't know exactly what that delay is, but I'm sure that like a big city like Albuquerque was probably a much more in line with like current cultural standards. But we're talking about Roswell, New Mexico, which is like a tiny little town that if it wasn't for the fact that it had the alien thing, which we did an episode on like 3 or 4 episodes back, but 6 years ago because we went on hiatus because of my leg injury. But if it wasn't for that fact, someone would be like Roswell, New Mexico, and you'd be like, what the fuck is that? It's like nothing. I'd never heard of Starbucks before I moved to California. And also like my only understanding of coffee was just a thing that old people drank to wake up in the morning. The real thing that was like this beacon of like, I'm in this like magical new world for me was when we moved to California, whenever I was in high school, coffee was like this phenomenon. It was like, oh, everybody drinks coffee. When I was in high school, like other students, like they drank coffee and they would get like coffee from Starbucks and be like walking around campus drinking coffee. And the big thing was they had like drive-through coffee places, like, Starbucks has a drive-through, but also like there was other like drive-through coffee shops and stuff. That was the thing where I was like, what the fuck? Like, I've never heard of this in my life. I thought coffee was just like a thing that old people drank to wake up. But when I moved to California, it was like everybody drank coffee and it was like this popular thing.
That was the real beacon on the hill of civilization.
I was like, what the fuck is a latte?
You're like pronouncing it wrong. You're like, what is a late?
Yeah, seriously.
Did you start drinking coffee when you first moved here? And you were like, I'm so fancy.
I never drank coffee until I was like 20. When I was in my 20s, I was dating somebody that worked at a coffee shop and I would go there and visit her. And even then I didn't drink coffee because I was like, I don't want fucking coffee. I don't drink this bullshit. And then one of her coworkers asked me if she could like test some like ideas on me. So she started like making different drinks and like having me try them. And they started out as like really kind of like floofy, like flavory type coffee drinks. Like the first coffee I ever drank was a coconut mocha. And I was like, this is actually pretty good.
It was the mocha nut that won you over.
And then like I worked like backwards from there, where it started off with like drinks that basically were just milkshakes with some coffee in it. And then like from there, I had regular coffee, but with like some flavored soy milk thing in it, which made it taste a lot better. And then from there, I worked down to just drinking black coffee. And now I drink black coffee every single day of my life.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know you love coffee.
Yeah, but I never drank coffee until I was like 20. I don't even know what the fuck I was talking about. I attribute that to why I had never heard of Flamin Hot Cheetos. I thought that they were like new, but they weren't new. But my understanding of the story was that there was a janitor who invented Flamin Hot Cheetos. And I thought that it happened in the early 2000s because I thought that Flamin Hot Cheetos came out in the early 2000s. That was my only knowledge of the story. I was surprised to learn that they were invented in the late 90s, and I was surprised to learn about all of this stuff, but I remember hearing that story about a janitor who invented them. I never heard the follow-up that it was a lie. You listen to the story and you're like, okay, this isn't like obscure. There was a huge viral sensation about this. There was this big thing where he had articles written about him in all these publications, and for like a week, it was the big viral story on the internet and on social media that this guy invented Flamin' Hot Cheetos, and then they were gonna make a movie about him. This is not an obscure story, and we all kind of know about it, right? But I feel like almost nobody knows about the second part of it, was that there was a follow-up a few months later where they were like, oh, never mind, this is a fucking lie. And I think that's a testament to the fact that like, that's how information works. The retraction never sticks in people's minds. And you see so many examples of this, right? Like, what is it? Episode 2 of Deep Cuts is Sophia Stewart. This story about this woman who supposedly created the Matrix franchise, and it was stolen from her by Warner Brothers and the Wachowskis, and she sued them and won $2 billion for copyright theft. This is a story that has been thoroughly debunked and has no factual merit whatsoever. And yet every couple of years it resurfaces and a whole new crowd of people believe it. And they share it on social media and be like, did you know that this fucking lady like invented the Matrix and they stole it from her? And then she won $2 billion. That story resurfaces every couple of years. And a new group of people are like, did you fucking know this shit? And every single time it gets debunked. And they're like, that never happened. Here's all these court documents proving it. She didn't win any lawsuit. They were all thrown out. The only lawsuit she won was that she literally sued her own lawyers for malpractice and won against them. And that's the lawsuit she won. She won against her lawyers for basically sucking at defending her in a case that got thrown out. But the story persists because nobody remembers the debunk. And I think that's just fundamentally how information works. Nobody remembers that second part where they're like, actually, that's not fucking true. Here's like the real evidence. The only part that sticks in people's minds is like that good story, you know? It's a great story that a janitor who was working on the ground floor of Frito Lay invented their most popular product and then became like an overnight success. And that's the other component of the story of the why of how the movie got made and how the story got to be allowed to be told for so long. That's the other part of it. There's your part, there's the other part, and we're gonna now unpack that. But perhaps this was some Stan Lee-esque revisionist history on PepsiCo's part. It's not uncommon for large corporations to steal the credit for successful products created by someone on their team and attribute its success to the entity of the company itself. In fact, given no other context, I'd be more likely to believe this than that Richard was lying. But Sam Dean with the LA Times was aware of this and dug much deeper than quoting an official statement from the company. Dean interviewed several former employees of Frito Lay, including some of the researchers on the team that developed Flamin' Hot Cheetos, and was able to piece together a lineage of the snack's creation. Whereas Richard was in California working at the Rancho Cucamonga plant, the product was actually developed jointly in Chicago and Plano, Texas. The original idea for Flamin' Hot Cheetos came along when market researchers in Chicago noticed that certain locally produced spicy Mexican snacks were outselling Frito Lay products in corner stores in the city. Based on this research, they tasked a team at the corporate headquarters in Plano, including Lynn Greenfield, with creating something to compete with those snacks. Her team developed the slurry for Flamin' Hot Cheetos in a lab in Texas, and she personally came up with the name Flamin' Hot Cheetos. Moreover, Dean interviewed over 20 former executives at Frito during this time period that Richard describes in his story to get to the bottom of whether or not his famous pitch meeting where he said that much market share ever happened. And according to them, it didn't. Nobody alive and reachable by the media has any memory of such an event ever happening. As quoted by the LA Times, a former product manager for Frito Lay named Ken Lukaska said,
"If that story existed, believe me, we would have heard about it. This guy should run for office if he's that good at fooling everyone."
So once again, it bears repeating. He's out there with 2 published books and a speaking tour career while actively working at Frito Lay, where he's telling them not only that he invented Flamin Hot Cheetos, but he's talking about this pitch meeting where he's in front of all these executives, including names that he names, not just like, oh, some generic people. He names names and says, this guy was there, this guy was there, this guy said this. He's saying this for 30 years, and it goes uncontested. Nobody says anything. And then whenever actually put to the task, whenever somebody's like, hey, I created this, what the fuck? They come out with an official statement being like, this is not true. But they allowed this to happen for 30 years. So once again, why? But again, maybe this is all corporate propaganda designed to steal credit from Richard and assign it to a team of lackeys. Maybe they just don't want to feel responsible for potential royalties owed to a single individual responsible for coming up with one of their most popular products. We're going to get to why this is not possibly true, but it's a good point that like a possible theory here is, as we learn in the timeline of events, Richard has retired. He's no longer working at Frito Lay. So this is all happening in 2018. He retired just around that time. I think he retired in 2017, or maybe it was 2018. So he's retired. So there's a possible scenario in which they kind of let this go on because he was working at the company and he was like a big part of it. And like you were saying before, maybe it would have just been an embarrassment at a certain point to come out and be like, hey, we let this be said by one of our employees for all this time, but it's actually a lie. So maybe the timing of it is he retires, he's no longer at the company, and now that he's gone, now they're like, let's nip this in the bud. That's a possible scenario. Or a possible scenario is that he leaves the company and then they decide to basically fuck him over and steal the credit from him. And now that he's gone, now that he's no longer at the company, they're like, hey, now that he's not here anymore, let's clean this story up and prevent him from having any wiggle room to like claim ownership over this and get some kind of royalties from him or from us. That's a possible scenario. That could happen, but we're about to get into why that's not true.
I love you like saying, yeah, this could be true. I know it's not, but like it could be true. And then talking for 5 minutes about like, yeah, this could be true. It's fucking totally not, though. This guy's a piece of shit.
Because here's the thing. I'm really qualifying this because much like Sophia Stewart, the reason why Sophia Stewart's story perseveres is because people have exploited every potential little possible hole in the story to justify it. Every little part where it's like, oh, maybe that, they've used that and exploited it to come up with some kind of little lie as to why the story is true. So I really want to fill in every hole in this and really qualify, like, there's potential for this to happen. Maybe they're lying. Maybe they're just stealing the credit from Richard and he retired and that's why they chose to speak up about it and lie about it after 30 years. And I just really want to fill in all those holes. So, I mean, people will still come up with their little lies, but I want to do my most due diligence to fill in every little hole and make sure that I'm like, no, I've thoroughly interrogated this, and the journalists that wrote about this thoroughly interrogated this, and it's just not true. Well, first of all, it seems like if that were the case, PepsiCo would have likely moved to squash this claim years ago. It wasn't until Greenfield called to set the record straight that the company moved a finger to contest the claim. They seemed perfectly content with Richard spreading the story for years. Considering that they were likely consulted on the production of the film, they even seemed in support of his version of the story. But if that wasn't enough, there's actually a smoking gun in this entire saga that is undeniable. Richard claims to have come up with the idea for Flamin Hot Cheetos in the late 80s during PepsiCo's widely publicized war with Eagle Snacks and massive waves of layoffs. The version of the story depicted in all of his speaking engagements, his books, and the film all claim that during the time in the late 80s, he saw a video memo from the CEO of Frito Lay, Roger Enrico, called him and pitched the idea of Flamin' Hot Cheetos, and then Enrico brought him into a big pitch meeting with top executives. As the LA Times article states, Roger Enrico's name is mentioned 60 times in Richard's autobiography about the invention of Flamin' Hot Cheetos. The only issue is that Flamin' Hot Cheetos were released to the public in June of 1991 after being in the test market in the summer of 1990. And Roger Enrico didn't start working at Frito Lay until December of 1991. So Roger Enrico, the guy who is, like you said, mentioned 60 times in his book by name, and if you've seen the movie, he is a character played by my boy Monk himself. He didn't work at the company when Flamin' Hot Cheetos were released.
Every part of this story, I'm always like, but did he? I keep expecting there to be another turn. I keep expecting there to be another twist of like, Roger Enrico didn't work at Frito Lay. He worked at Scribo Bay, the company that fucking Richard worked at before Frito Lay. And it's a big twist where he's technically not lying because they created Flamin' Hot Cheetos, another company, and they brought it here.
No, yeah, there's not even like a thing of like, oh, he wasn't actually CEO. He was like head of marketing or something like that. And Richard just got it twisted in his mind. He wasn't an internal hire. He wasn't promoted. Roger Enrico was the president of a different company. I forget which one it was. I didn't write it down because it just wasn't actually relevant. But he was the president of a different company, and he was hired and brought into Frito Lay in December of 1991. So he was brought to the company wholesale for the first time in December of 1991. But Flamin' Hot Cheetos came out in June of 1991. And even further than that, they had already been invented and they were being tested as early as 1989. It's impossible that Richard was inspired by Enrico's memo or pitched the product to him because Flamin' Hot Cheetos came out before he even stepped foot into the company's buildings. At the time Flamin' Hot Cheetos were released, Robert Beebe was the CEO of Frito Lay and Wayne Calloway was the CEO of PepsiCo. And while Enrico died in 2016 and couldn't give his account of events for the LA Times article, he had never publicly made any kind of statement about Richard in his entire career, despite Richard basically looking to him as a mentor, according to his story. So, you know, it's like, oh, why didn't we just ask Richard Enrico? Well, he was dead. But for a guy who mentions him in his book 60 times by name, and there's a character of Richard Enrico in the movie, he literally never mentioned Richard ever. He never said his name publicly, ever.
It's really strange, too, because if somebody was talking all this shit, saying this fake story, putting my name in there, I at very least would have been like, yeah, I don't know, man. Publicly. Because if this guy's lying about how great you are, he could also lie about how fucking terrible you are, you know?
Yeah, it is weird. And you gotta wonder what, and this goes into this unpacking that I talked about earlier, but you gotta wonder what is going on here. Because you're right, Roger Enrico, which I think I just called him Richard Enrico, but these names are all, it's Richard, Roger, Roy, Roger Enrico, he was retired from working. So for his entire life after he retired, he was no longer working for PepsiCo or Frito Lay. He had no allegiances to them. So all these years that he was just retired and had no allegiances to anybody, he never once did an interview and was like, yeah, I don't know what the fuck this guy's talking about. None of this ever happened. And you got to wonder why that is. Is it because he just purposely didn't? Did he hear the story and then just was like, I'll just let him have his fun? Or is it because he just never heard it?
Or does Richard Montañez have something on this guy where it's like he found him having sex with his secretary one night and he's like, look, I'm going to use you to anchor this story that's going to make me famous.
He's like blackmailing people and that's why they let him say these things. You got to wonder who knows what the story is, but it's so weird that this company never made a statement debunking or refuting his claims. The individuals that he called by name in his story never came forward and were like, hey, this isn't fucking true. I never did this shit. Like you said, I definitely would. If I found out one day that there was a guy going around and he was doing 3 speaking engagements a day in which he told a whole story about how I was instrumental in shaping his life and did all these things for him, and I did these things that I couldn't have physically done, I would be like, what the fuck? I didn't do this shit. I would definitely say something. So maybe Richard just got majorly mixed up, and it was actually Robert Beebe who inspired him to create Flamin' Hot Cheetos and brought him to the pitch meeting and served as his personal mentor. Well, no, because Sam Dean actually tracked down Roger Enrico's secretary, who confirmed that Richard's infamous phone call actually did happen. And this is what I was talking about. We're getting into it. In episode 1, I said, remember, I know I'm saying that the whole thing is a lie, but what I mean is that him inventing Flamin' Hot Cheetos is a lie. This whole story isn't a lie. Parts of it are true. Which parts of it are? We're going to get into the parts of it that are true and the parts that are not.
I want someone to have a counter that just says we're going to get into it and we're going to unpack that.
According to Enrico's secretary, Richard did call Enrico's office and asked to speak with him after watching his motivational video memo. And she really did connect him through with Enrico so he could pitch an idea. However, the event happened sometime between 1992 and 1993, rather than in the late 80s, as he claims, a few years after Flamin' Hot Cheetos had already been released. So what did Richard pitch to Enrico if Flamin' Hot Cheetos was already on shelves? We'll get to that in a second. For now, let's talk about the real story of what actually seemed to happen based on the investigation by the LA Times. According to accounts from former employees as well as newspaper articles from the time, Richard was hired as a janitor in the late 1970s, but he didn't toil away as a mop pusher for years only to come up with a miraculous idea that got him hired as an executive sight unseen. Richard, having developed a fascination with the actual production of the snacks in the factory where he worked, learned as much as he could about them and was eventually promoted to a machinist shortly after being hired. He was only a janitor for a little under a year before moving up to inspecting and running the snack producing machinery. So if you're keeping score, in a way this story is more impressive than the story that Richard tells. He started out as an illiterate ground floor hire with no prior work experience. He hadn't had a real job in his entire life. He got hired as a janitor, and within a year, he showed so much promise and acumen and initiative that he got promoted to a machine worker in the factory floor, like running the machines. That's incredibly impressive, especially in the late 70s for, at the time, what was considered like an unhireable person who was Mexican. That's incredibly impressive. That's more impressive than I worked as a janitor for like 5 years and then came up with an idea and then like became an executive. But it doesn't service the narrative that Richard kind of wanted to tell, as we'll start to get into, which is why he changes it. But in reality, he was promoted to this much higher position in under a year at the company. And also, it's funny because you brought this up about the movie and you haven't seen the movie. We'll talk about this more later, but the movie went into production after this article came out, basically debunking this and showing that it was a lie. And so the movie is really fascinating if you know the story. If you don't know the story, then it's weird. If you watch the movie without knowing any of this, there would be like a few moments that you just wouldn't even notice. Or if you noticed them, you would just be like, that was kind of a weird thing to say. Oh well. But when you know the story, it's really fascinating to watch the movie because there's multiple points in the movie where they basically, in light of this article coming out and all these facts being revealed, they had to go in and be like, we got to add a little thing here.
It's like he's giving his like big speech at the end of the movie and he's like, I, Richard Montañez, have created this product, Flamin' Hot Cheetos. And then it's a big close up on his face. And then off camera, there's a voice that goes, but did he?
Bro, that's literally what happens. Not literally that, not like a voice off camera goes, did he? But kind of. Like, I'll explain it to you in a second, but that's almost exactly what happens. But another thing that they build into the movie is once this was revealed and it was like, oh, he didn't work as a janitor there for 5 years and then invented this thing. He actually got promoted to a production machine worker. So one of the things they build into the movie is that throughout this thing happening, there's a completely unimportant, useless side plot where he's a janitor and he takes interest in what the engineers, the machine workers are doing. And he's like, wow, that's really cool what you guys do. And there's one engineer there who's played by that guy who's like the Allstate insurance guy. I don't know what that guy's name is, but he plays one of the engineers and he's like a curmudgeon-y, like grumpy guy that doesn't want anyone talking to him, and he like takes his job very seriously, and Richard kind of like wears him down and befriends him, and then the guy starts mentoring him, and teaches him how to run the machines, the side plot goes nowhere. It has no actual relevance to the movie. It doesn't lead to anything where he's like, yeah, and now I became a machine worker. It just happens like to the side of the movie. But the reason why they did it is because they had to add something in there to kind of squint and be like, we're telling this story, but this is really what happened. And we're kind of just going to acknowledge it.
Yeah, we're kind of just going to not really pay attention to it, but like, it's there.
Yeah, so there's this thing that happens in the margins of the film where he takes an interest in the machines and he gets mentored by this engineer and he teaches him how to run the machines. And then at the end of the movie, when they're like, oh, we got to take over the marketing of Flamin Hot Cheetos because they're not marketing them right. They're failing because the white people aren't marketing them right. We got to do it as a grassroots movement. They're like, hey, do you want us to run these machines for you? And then Richard's like, nah, I can do it myself because he taught me. And if you were watching the movie and you didn't know the story, you'd be like, why did that happen? What was the point of that?
It's like they made the movie and then they had to do Marvel-styled reshoots to like fit the article's narrative, but not enough to change the plot of the movie. Like they couldn't make it not about him making Flamin' Hot Cheetos, but they also had to be like, we gotta fucking fill in this article. I don't know. He learns how to use a fucking whatever lathe.
Yeah, I mean that is literally what it is. To the point where it almost feels like reshot and then like added in, where they like shot the movie and then they went and they're like, we're gonna spend 15 grand doing pickups where we shoot this whole B story where he learns how to run the machines, and then we're just gonna like edit it into the movie. He worked as a machinist at the factory for years until the early 90s, when he really did see Enrico's inspirational video memo, and with the encouragement of his friend and former Frito Lay executive Al Carey, called Enrico at his office to pitch him an idea. At this point, he was already a senior machinist at the factory with a lot more sway than he portrays in his version of the story. So this thing that happened in the mid to late 80s where Eagle Snacks came out and Frito Lay conducted 1,000 layoffs to come up with like ideas and put a lot of money into market research. This stuff happened before any of the stuff that happened to Richard. Richard lived and worked through the layoffs because, once again, this is almost more impressive than his version of the story. He survived the layoffs because he stood out and was like an exemplary employee. And he just didn't get laid off. He made it through the layoffs. And this whole thing where he sees the video memo from Richard Enrico or Roger Enrico and he calls him and all this stuff, it happened after the layoffs and after the company recovered. All that stuff was already over and done with. The company was no longer in trouble. And then this stuff happened. And not only that, but he didn't just like call his office on a whim and miraculously get put through. He was like a senior executive at the company, or not a senior executive. He was a senior machine operator at the company. So he would have likely had some contact with the executives. And he was friends with one of the executives at Frito Lay, and the executive, Al Carey, was like, hey, yeah, call Roger. I'll tell him to answer. So the whole thing, parts of it was actually more impressive because he climbed the ladder really fast because he showed so much initiative and promise. But the key parts of it that I think Richard wanted to be impressive, the miracleness of it, that he had nothing but a wing and a prayer, and he picked up that phone and he called Roger Enrico's office, and I don't know why, but they put me through. That part wasn't true. That part wasn't as impressive. He just called his office because he was allowed to, you know.
Yeah, it's funny too, because it's kind of like the narrative that's being woven is, and then I was this fucking guy who couldn't read and they took pity on me, but my idea was so good I became rich and famous. And in fact, it was like, yeah, so then I was an equal working at this company, being a very skilled laborer, and then we all just like kind of agreed that these things should be done, and then I did them.
Yeah, we'll get to this as we finish this off, but I think you're starting to see the pattern, and the pattern is Richard's like career, his story is like pretty normal. It's impressive and he accomplished a lot, but it wasn't crazy. it was just kind of like normal. It was just like, yeah, I like got a job in a company and then like worked really hard and then they promoted me. And then I just kept doing that.
I just kind of lived a typical life.
And he doesn't like that. He doesn't like that his story was normal. He had also already been commended by the company for developing a program to reduce assembly line waste at the factory. So it makes a lot more sense that Enrico would take his call. And when he talked to Enrico on the phone, according to a news article from December of 1993, he pitched him the idea for Flamin Hot Popcorn, an extension of the pre-existing and already popular Flamin Hot Cheetos product. So his big idea was less of inventing a whole new product for the company and more just saying, we should put this on some other shit, right? And again, according to newspaper and magazine clippings from the time, Flamin Hot Popcorn really did come out in 1994. The timeline matches up for this to be the real sequence of events. Richard, already on an upward career track within the company, was promoted to start coming up with more ideas to service the burgeoning Hispanic consumer market that had already been stimulated by Flamin Hot Cheetos. And this is when he actually developed a real product that can historically be credited to him. The Sabrositas line of snack foods, which were a variation of existing Frito Lay snacks aimed at the Hispanic market, such as Flamin Hot Popcorn, Flamin Hot Fritos, and more. So basically, the real story is this product came out in the early 90s, Flamin Hot Cheetos. And it was like a product that kind of saved the company. I mean, I don't think it saved the company as in if Flamin Hot Cheetos hadn't come out, Frito Lay would have like gone bankrupt, but it saved them from having less than 50% market share. That was the thing that they were concerned about. They were like, oh fuck, we don't almost have a monopoly on this. And then they came out with Flamin Hot Cheetos, and Flamin Hot Cheetos brought them back to almost having a monopoly on this. So you have this like flagship product, Flamin Hot Cheetos, and then they basically tasked Richard with like, hey, Flamin Hot Cheetos did very well with the Hispanic market. So when you think about it like that, the Hispanic market was an untapped market that we weren't taking advantage of before. And we started taking advantage of it, and it brought us back to over 50% market share. So you, Richard, you're going to start a whole division, and you're going to make products only for this Hispanic market. So while Flamin Hot Cheetos is kind of like a flagship thing, and we're just going to keep it as its own brand, you're going to create a sub-brand of other spicy snacks, and it's going to be called Sabrositas. So what he was tasked with, and what he basically became an executive at the company doing, was creating variants of Flamin Hot Cheetos.
But explaining that to civilians is hard, so you say, I created Flamin Hot Cheetos, which is not accurate, but people understand what you mean, and initially you kind of justify it to yourself as like, well, it's not really true, but it's also not true.
Like, I created Flamin Hot something.
Yeah, I made Flamin Hot stuff. Wasn't exactly the fucking Flamin Hot Cheetos. But like, I do all the Flamin Hots. I'm Flamin Hot. Look at me. I'm hot. I'm too hot for this. Believe when I say I fucking did this shit.
Yeah, and you can hear the iterations of that story being told at parties and things like that, because everybody has done some version of that, where it's like, my job is weird. It's not easy to explain to people, especially people who don't know what like digital marketing is really, and don't know how that intersects with social media, and they don't understand the nuances of the fact that I kind of do both. So you start off with like, well, what do you do for a living? And you're like, oh, well, I started off working in social media and like creating content, but then I got more into like the marketing side of it. And then I kind of transitioned into doing more of that. And so I still create social media content, but I'm more focused on like the marketing. And then you see their eyes glaze over, and then you're like, well, that story did not go over well. And then the next time you say something else that's a little bit shorter. And then like 5 times in, when you're at like Thanksgiving and like your uncle asks you what you do for a living for the 10th time, you're like, oh yeah, I create viral videos for the internet. That's not exactly true, but you're like tired of telling a story and like seeing their eyes like roll into the back of their heads.
Yeah, like the version of it is like, oh yeah, I'm Richard. Hi, nice to meet you. And I'm the head machinist, but I'm actually transitioning into being the kind of guy looking over this new line of like spicy foods aimed at Hispanic markets. Oh, all right. Oh, hey, I'm Richard, and I control this line called the Sabritas line or whatever the fuck it's called. Oh, all right. Oh, actually, hey, I'm Richard. I work with Flamin Hot Cheetos. Oh, I love Flamin Hot Cheetos. Hey, I'm Richard. I control Flamin Hot Cheetos. Oh, I love Flamin Hot Cheetos. Hey, I'm Richard. I created Flamin Hot Cheetos. Oh my God, wow, you created Flamin Hot Cheetos?
Yeah, and at first it's like you're just telling this story to like people at parties and like Thanksgiving and things like that, and it's like it just makes more sense to tell it that way. And then you slip up and you say it in like a more important context and it goes over well. It's like that guy from the League who told people he was in 9/11, where he said that it started off where he would move to LA and he went to comedy clubs and he'd be talking to other comics, and it was like not long after 9/11. So people would be like, oh, were you there? And he'd be like, yeah, I was like in the city. It was pretty freaky. And then like the next time it'd be like, yeah, I was there. And then the next time it was like, he just started saying he was in the building. And at first it was like, it was just telling it to some other random comic. It was mostly harmless. It was like impressing this one random guy who would never talk to again. But then that guy comes over and tells you to tell that story to a different person. And then eventually it snowballs and gets out of hand. And then you're telling it on Howard Stern. And according to former employees, almost every detail of Richard's story about the creation of Flamin Hot Cheetos actually happened, but with Sabrositas. The grassroots marketing, the Tupperware parties, everything. It's all true. It was just all done to bring a completely different product to life. So going back to episode 1 and the preface I gave, the whole story is true. Every part of Richard's story is true. But it took place 3 years later than he said it did, and it was about Flamin' Hot popcorn and Sabrositas. It seems that in Richard's personal mythologizing of himself in order to carve out a career as a motivational speaker and book author, it was just a more compelling narrative to say he invented one of the most popular snack foods in history as a lowly janitor, rather than the real story, that he kind of worked his way up the corporate ladder at the company in a very standard way, and then at some point suggested that they make a popcorn variant of the most successful snack food in history. Oddly enough, during a public appearance in 2019, when Al Carey was accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award, Richard made an appearance where he told a version of his Flamin' Hot Cheetos story, except in this version, Carey had been the one who created the motivational video memo that inspired him to create Flamin' Hot Cheetos. He never told this version of the story ever again and reverted to saying it was Enrico immediately after. So it seems like Richard's story is able to adapt to the moment to serve whatever purpose he's aiming for, even if it's just to butter up his pal during an award speech. Reports show that Frito Lay was deeply involved in the production of the Flamin' Hot film, providing facts and details that they could use to write the script. Nobody ever publicly came out disputing Richard's story he was telling across the country and in nationally published books, despite the fact that he still worked there. At no point did the company ever refute his claims until Lynn Greenfield contacted them. And the movie was produced despite the fact that its events had been demonstrably disproven. Frito Lay reportedly did inform the production team of Flamin' Hot about their investigation and the concern that the story might not be factually correct, but they continued on with the production anyway. The only change made to the final film is a brief moment towards the end where characters offhandedly mention that there was a different spicy Cheeto product being developed by scientists in Chicago, to which Richard brushes it off and says that his version is better. And then they blink and you'll miss it admit in the film that the final product that was released to the public was based on the Chicago team's recipe, not Richard's. It's a really bizarre way of essentially doing the entire film based on Richard's story, and then quickly, for legal purposes, sneaking in a tiny caveat that essentially undoes the entire movie. But it's so quick and mumbled by the script that most people probably wouldn't even understand what it meant unless they knew the full backstory. So what you said before, where it was like, I invented Flamin' Hot Cheetos, and then a voice off camera was like, but did he? That's like almost exactly what happens. So basically, this is what happens in the movie. The end of the movie is a montage, or like a sequence of shots. And it's like after the big pitch meeting where he says, that much market share. And they're like, we're gonna make Flamin' Hot Cheetos, you son of a bitch. They make the product, and then they're like, the product's flopping. Nobody was buying it. And Richard's like, that's bullshit. The reason why it's flopping is because they're not marketing it right. We gotta market it. And then the whole rest of the movie is a montage where he's like, we gotta make some of these Flamin' Hot Cheetos ourselves. And I'm gonna use the machine because this whole time I was training to become a machine operator. And they produce all these bags, and then they go out and they take the bags, they take them to Tupperware parties, they take them out to the park, they take them out to quinceañeras, and they're giving them out to people. And people are like, these are fucking good, motherfucker. And the thing becomes a success. And then during this montage, Richard is narrating it. And he's like, and we got out there and we marketed it for real. And we did this. We took it out to quinceañeras. We took it out to Tupperware parties. And people liked it. And they started wanting to buy more. And then at some point during this montage, he just slips in and he goes, and yeah, there was this other thing that was being made by these scientists in Chicago or whatever. But like, whatever, that was just something else. But we were marketing it and people loved it. And then at the end, yeah, they used the Chicago version, but like, we know what the best version of it was. That's literally how the movie goes.
I love it. I love it. It's so fucking craven. But even so, like, how did they get it that far? Like, how did Frito Lay how do they chill with this? Like, that's crazy.
Well, I think I know exactly the reason why. And it's almost what you said earlier in the episode, but a little different. So what happened? Why did Frito Lay seemingly support this provable lie for decades? And why did they make a whole movie based on what they knew was a lie? Usually big corporations are quick to refute any wild claims by individuals by the threat of lawsuits, and you'd think they'd want to quash the film entirely immediately after realizing it was all a lie. Well, the answer is simple. It's a good fucking story. It's a lot better than a team of food scientists developed the product in a lab after extensive market research designed to crush local competition by creating a product that would sell better, thus putting several mom and pop snack food companies out of business in the pursuit of endless profit. It was a mutually beneficial lie. Richard got to go around earning hundreds of thousands of dollars and turning himself into a living legend with an amazing rags to riches story for years. He was able to transform into an inspirational figure and living example of how Latino people could overcome adversity and achieve the American dream in the face of racism and systemic oppression, which is a worthy and valid message to spread for sure. In exchange for just kind of turning a blind eye to it, Frito Lay were handed an amazing public relations shield in the form of a story that made them look like champions of the people. They took a chance on a poor Mexican janitor and came out the other end looking like so many Sandra Bullocks in The Blind Sides. A much cleaner public image than money-hungry conglomerate who created a product so they could crush small businesses in Chicago. It makes perfect sense why they would allow the lie to be told. They were probably mad when Greenfeld called them out on it. So while this isn't confirmed, this is my opinion. And your thought was like, oh, they didn't notice the lie for so long. And by the time they noticed, they'd let it go on for too long. And if they had come out and squashed the lie, it would have been like a bad PR nightmare for them, where they're essentially being like, this motivational Mexican man who has this story about like overcoming oppression and racism, like, that guy's fucking lying. Like, that would look bad on them. And that, I think that's correct. But I don't think it was they just let the lie go on for too long and they got in over their heads. I think they fucking loved this lie. Because the real story is they had spies going into bodegas in Chicago and looking at all these Mexican-owned small businesses and the types of products that they were putting out, and they stole the idea for them, and they came out with their big corporate version of it, and they replaced all of those small mom and pop Mexican-owned businesses with their product and crushed the competition. So the version of the story where a Mexican janitor invented the idea and the CEO of the company took a chance on him, and it revolutionized the company, and then they promoted him to an executive, that's a better story than they could have ever made up.
It's almost like they've got this simmering PR problem that nobody wants to talk about, and then Richard comes along and says, I'll just be a human PR meat shield for you. Like, you let me take the story as my own, and I will make the future PR fiasco of you definitely stole all this shit from local small businesses and make it go away. And I'll fall on it, and I will use my cultural heritage as a means by which to give you a quote-unquote corporate win. And at the end of the day, also be uplifting to my own community in this weird, dark, cynical way.
Yes. So Richard Montañez made millions of dollars from a book and speaking tour career. and Frito Lay got like an early 90s version of like amazing rainbow capitalism with this story that makes them look like the wokest people on planet Earth. So I'm sure that they fucking loved this. And they were like, yeah, tell that, whatever, Richard, you're good. And the thing is that it worked for 30 years because who reads autobiographies of chip company executives?
No shit, right?
Other business bro people. So he made millions of dollars, but this story was very low key and localized to a certain type of person. It was read by like businessy people, and he would go on these speaking tours and he would talk to kids, and the kids are just like, yeah, I believe every word of this because I'm a child and this is just an adult telling me this. But the fatal flaw, and I think everybody would agree, I think Frito Lay and I think Richard Montañez would agree that the fatal flaw, and if they could go back in time and undo it, they probably would, was the movie.
Right, because the movie flies too close to the sun. The movie pulls in too much attention and everyone realizes what's going on.
Yeah. And the movie didn't really do that well anyway. So it was kind of almost like all for nothing. It ended up not getting a theatrical release. It was put out on Disney Plus and Hulu. And like, who saw Flamin' Hot?
Not me.
Other than me, who watched it for this episode. Who gives a shit about how Flamin' Hot Cheetos were invented? Who cares about that? The fact that this whole thing is a lie is way more interesting than the story of how Flamin' Hot Cheetos were invented. Who cares? So, I think everybody would agree that they should have just not made the movie. And I think everything would have been fine.
Eva Longoria is like sitting alone in a darkened mansion being like, I never should have made that fucking movie.
Yeah, because it kind of toppled everything. It killed this lie, and I'm sure it probably took a pretty drastic chunk out of Richard's whole thing. I think they probably just shouldn't have made the movie. But I think my favorite part of this story is how they changed the script to the film to reflect the article and the details that came out. The fact that they just slipped in to a montage at the end of the movie. And sure, the other recipe was the one that they actually used. But like, fuck it.
But like, more movies should end with like, but fuck it.
Yeah, there's a line in the end of the movie that completely renders the whole movie pointless.
I love it.
The final question, though, is whether or not the lie has done any harm. Is it a big deal? On one hand, true or not, it has served as a deeply inspirational story for young minorities looking to succeed in a world not always designed to give them any kind of a leg up. Maybe it's a noble lie that has served as the origin story for many future successes. But then again, it has also snatched credit away from the actual people who created the product, which they deserve to have, even if them having created it isn't a particularly compelling or motivational story. I don't know for sure. All I know is I wish I had half the confidence and charisma as Richard Montañez, the undisputed king of corporate kayfabe. Because here's the thing, the breadth of his lie, the scope of it is nowhere near a J.J. Arms. J.J. Arms crafted an entire fictional life full of thousands of details that were a network of made up nonsense, right? His whole life is a lie. But at the end of the day, his lies were all negatives, unprovable. Well, I mean, you could prove them, but you would have to care enough to go through and prove that all these claims he's made is true. Did you actually rescue Marlon Brando's grandson? Did you actually go on this secret mission in this fucking foreign country in the 70s or whatever? They're like lies that you can't really confirm whether they're not easy to prove. And there's not a lot of people around to be like, hey, that's not fucking true. Richard just had one lie, but he lied about something that thousands of people could verifiably say, that's not true. And he just skated by on confidence for 30 years until the wrong person happened to hear the lie and was like, wait a minute, I'm making some phone calls.
I am fascinated by the types of personality that do this thing, though. Like, I'm very interested in I am driven to go out and take the glory that I have not earned, stolen valor, however you want to phrase it. And I think that most of them, people are wronged. And in this one, mostly a corporation and a bunch of faceless scientists that also kind of fucked over people were wronged.
Yeah.
There's no real downside there.
And also it was like work for hire owned by the company. Like they wouldn't have like gotten royalties for this invention ever anyway.
Yeah, but it's just interesting how this plays out where the story doesn't feel good, but it's not really as bad as it kind of sounds like it is, but also is interesting in the way that people are twisting and turning it. It's a fairly fascinating conundrum.
Yeah, and also the other thing, and this is the whole, to go full circle with us deciding whether we did the episode or not in the first place, the fact that it's not just a lie, like a full whole cloth lie. The real story is also very impressive and very inspirational and very worthy of going around and speaking with a bunch of young Hispanic youths about. But it's not sexy. And I don't think he would have been able to sell like a book on it. And it wouldn't have been turned into a movie, If it was just like this Mexican guy did have to overcome racism and a difficult life. And he just kind of worked really hard and did that.
Fingers crossed we all get that opportunity someday.
Somewhere. Sometime.
Well, on that note, I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Spandrew Spice.
This has been Deep Cuts. You can find me on the internet at heydavebaker.com, where you can find Mary Tyler Moorhawk and my new book, Halloween Boy, issue 6, which just came out at San Diego Comic-Con. Spandrew, where can people find you on the internet?
You could have found me at San Diego Comic-Con as well, because despite the fact that I said I wasn't going, I ended up going. And I wheeled around that sumbitch on a little knee scooter, and I looked fucking ridiculous, but fuck it. But you can't find me on social media, because I'm not on social media. But if you want to get the book by your dear beloved Papa Price, you can go to his website, dapricewrites.com, and get Deadbolt AI Private Eye, a comic about a robot detective in the future solving crimes. You can follow us on social media by going to Facebook and searching Deep Cuts Podcast. You can join our Facebook group, the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group, where we talk about the show and make memes and other cool stuff. You can join our Discord server, bit.ly.com/DeepCutsDiscord, where we talk about the show, make memes, play games, and other cool stuff as well. You can follow us on Instagram at Deep Cuts Pod. You can follow us on TikTok at Mystery Treehouse. You can follow me on TikTok at Deadboy Detective. And also, I invented talkies. Deep Cuts is a production by Boy Genius Media. If you'd like to find this show and others like it, please visit boygeniusmedia.com or deepcutspod.com.
If you want to join in on post-episode discussions, please join the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group. Finally, subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional video content.
The incidental music for this episode was created by D. Catalano, whose music can be found at wekeepoddhours.bandcamp.com.